She rented the narrow upstairs room because it overlooked the depot, and every dawn she could hear the deep whistle of the locomotives echo across Bracken Ridge before the first rays of sunlight slipped over the eastern hills, reminding her that somewhere beyond every horizon, another town waited for another train, another family, another chance, and she welcomed the familiar sound because it carried memories of standing beside her father as a little girl, while he explained that every train hauled not only freight, but hopes that belonged to people they would never meet. For nearly 4 years, life unfolded with quiet steadiness. Her handwriting became known for its remarkable precision in the freight ledgers. Warehouse foremen trusted her calculations because she never rounded numbers carelessly, never erased mistakes without recording them honestly, and never accepted shortcuts simply because everyone else considered them harmless. During evenings, she repaired cracked tables, rocking chairs, cupboards, and church pews, often returning furniture looking finer than when it had first been built. Families who could not afford payment left baskets of vegetables, jars of preserves, fresh eggs, or sacks of flour outside her door before sunrise, and she accepted every gift with humble gratitude because she understood that generosity came in many forms. Had anyone asked whether she considered herself wealthy, she would have smiled and answered that wealth could be measured by peaceful sleep and trusted neighbors, rather than heavy purses. Unfortunately, peaceful seasons sometimes persuade us that the world values honesty as much as we do, when in truth, dishonesty often waits patiently for someone trustworthy enough to carry its blame. The freight company where Evelyn worked belonged to a respected businessman named Horace Bellamy, a polished gentleman whose expensive waistcoats and carefully waxed mustache inspired confidence among investors and travelers alike. He spoke softly, attended every church gathering, donated generously whenever photographers visited from larger cities, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that Bracken Ridge had become prosperous, because responsible men guided its future. Few noticed that he rarely looked laborers in the eye, or that widows seeking delayed payments often waited outside his office until sunset, before being turned away with polite excuses. Evelyn noticed, but she believed kindness could soften almost anyone over time. She continued balancing ledgers faithfully, assuming that fairness eventually reached every honest heart. Then, one rainy afternoon, a shipment of silver mining equipment disappeared somewhere between 2 neighboring depots. The cargo had been insured for a tremendous sum, enough to threaten the company's reputation if questions spread beyond the county. Horace Bellamy assembled employees inside the warehouse office, his expression filled with rehearsed disappointment rather than genuine surprise. One by one, he questioned clerks, porters, conductors, and bookkeepers, while local officials stood silently nearby taking notes. When Evelyn's turn arrived, he gently placed one of her own ledger books upon the desk and opened it to a page containing figures that had somehow been altered. Numbers no longer matched shipment records. Dates had been changed. Signatures appeared where none had existed before. Evelyn stared in stunned silence because although the handwriting resembled hers, tiny differences betrayed another hand attempting careful imitation. She calmly explained that someone had modified the pages after she completed them, but Horace merely sighed as though disappointed by the explanation he had expected all along. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. None wished to accuse the town's most respected businessman when a solitary bookkeeper stood before them, insisting invisible hands had rewritten official records. Rumors moved faster than trains. By evening, people whispered that Evelyn Hart had manipulated freight accounts for years. By the following afternoon, merchants quietly refused her credit. Customers canceled furniture repairs without explanation. Mothers who once greeted her warmly now guided children across the street before passing. The boarding house owner apologized through trembling lips while placing Evelyn's traveling case outside the front door. "Please understand," the woman whispered, refusing to meet her eyes. "My guests are frightened. They believe trouble follows scandal." Evelyn did not argue. She knew fear rarely listened to reason. She gathered her belongings beneath a gray sky and walked slowly toward the edge of town, carrying everything she still owned. Her father's chisels wrapped in old cloth, her mother's sewing basket, 2 dresses, a wool blanket, the family Bible, and a leather pouch containing $3 and 14 cents after paying her final week's rent. She spent that first night beneath the awning of an abandoned grain warehouse, where rain dripped steadily through broken boards, while cold winds swept across empty freight yards. Hunger arrived before dawn, but loneliness hurt far more than an empty stomach. She wondered not why strangers believed accusations, but why neighbors who had known her kindness for years never questioned them. Morning offered little comfort. Notices bearing her name appeared near the depot, warning merchants against extending credit until the investigation concluded. Church members politely lowered their heads rather than wave. Even children who once admired the tiny wooden toys she carved now stared uncertainly from behind their parents. Days became a slow procession of closed doors. She searched tirelessly for honest work in neighboring settlements, but word traveled ahead of her along the railroad lines. Every station master seemed already aware of the scandal. Every warehouse had suddenly filled every available position. Every shopkeeper apologized before refusing her. By the end of the week, she understood that reputation could vanish more quickly than smoke leaving a locomotive chimney. On the seventh evening, she wandered beyond the last warehouses, toward an abandoned maintenance siding, where rusted rails disappeared beneath weeds taller than her shoulders. Broken freight wagons rested there like forgotten skeletons. Rainwater collected inside cracked barrels. Bent signal posts leaned at impossible angles. It was a place where useful things had been discarded after everyone decided repair required more effort than replacement. Naturally, Evelyn felt strangely at home there. An elderly yard watchman named Silas Rowan noticed her examining the forgotten rail equipment. His beard had grown as white as mountain snow, and years of coal smoke had permanently darkened the creases around his eyes. He carried a lantern despite the lingering daylight, because habit had become stronger than necessity. "Looking for shelter?" he asked gently. Evelyn admitted she was. Silas studied her for several moments before pointing toward the farthest siding where an old wooden railroad car rested alone beneath sprawling cottonwood trees. Time had peeled away much of its paint, leaving faded traces of deep forest green beneath rust and weather. One set of wheels had sunk slightly into the earth, and vines climbed across its iron steps, as though nature itself intended to claim it forever. "Nobody's wanted that coach for nearly 20 years, Silas said quietly. "Rail company auctioned every usable piece long ago. That one never sold because folks say it's cursed with bad memories." Evelyn almost smiled. She had discovered that people frequently described neglected things as cursed simply because repairing them required patience. "Can it still keep out the rain?" she asked. Silas chuckled softly. "Mostly." He explained that the railroad technically still owned the abandoned coach, but an office clerk had been instructed to dispose of it for any reasonable offer before winter, because inspectors planned to clear the forgotten siding. $2.75 would probably satisfy the paperwork, since the lumber alone held little value after decades of weather. Many people had laughed at the suggestion of buying such a ruin. Evelyn looked toward the lonely railroad car standing quietly beneath drifting leaves, and instead of seeing decay, she noticed sturdy oak beams beneath cracked paint, solid iron braces hidden beneath rust, and windows that, though clouded with dust, remained mostly intact. She also remembered her father's voice, telling her that the strongest timber was usually the piece everyone else abandoned. By sunset, she had exchanged $2.75 for a handwritten bill of sale that made her the unlikely owner of an abandoned railroad car everyone else considered worthless, leaving only 39 cents in her possession as she climbed the worn iron steps carrying a lantern, completely unaware that the first night inside that forgotten carriage would bring her face to face with the first whisper of the promise someone had hidden there decades before. She pushed open the heavy sliding door with both hands, and the rusty rollers groaned in protest before finally surrendering, allowing a cool breath of stale air to drift from the abandoned railroad car, as though it had been waiting years for someone to enter again. Her lantern cast long golden shadows across rows of weathered wooden benches, still bolted to the floor, their varnish cracked but surprisingly solid beneath decades of dust. Cobwebs shimmered between brass luggage racks overhead, while tiny particles floated lazily through the lantern light, like forgotten memories finally stirred awake. Rain tapped softly against the curved roof, yet inside the old coach the sound became gentle rather than lonely. And for the first time since Bracken Ridge had cast her aside, Evelyn felt something she had nearly forgotten. She felt sheltered. The windows were clouded by grime, but only two were broken, and those she covered with loose planks stacked near the rear entrance. She swept the floor with a bundle of pine branches, tied together with twine, gathering years of leaves, dirt, and bird feathers into neat piles before carrying them outside. Every stroke of her makeshift broom revealed stronger oak flooring than anyone would have expected from a railroad car abandoned for 2 decades. The wood still carried the rich scent of old timber beneath the dampness, reminding her of afternoons spent inside her father's workshop, where every rescued board held another chance to become useful. By the time darkness settled fully over the forgotten siding, she had arranged her blanket across 2 facing benches, stacked her few belongings beside the wall, and lit a second candle from the stub she always carried inside her sewing basket. It was humble, cold, and imperfect, yet after a week of sleeping beneath porches and warehouse awnings, the abandoned coach felt almost like a home. Outside, another freight train thundered past on the active main line several hundred yards away, its whistle echoing across the valley before gradually disappearing into the mountains. The old railroad car trembled slightly from the distant vibration, causing dust to drift from the ceiling in delicate clouds. Evelyn smiled faintly. Still remembers the trains, she whispered to herself. She slept deeply, despite the hard benches, and just before dawn, she awoke to a strange sound. Unlike the creaking timbers or settling roof she had already begun to recognize. It was a slow metallic tapping, 3 soft knocks, then silence. She remained perfectly still. Again the tapping came. 3 deliberate knocks from somewhere beneath the rear end of the coach. Lantern in hand, she carefully crossed the floor. The tapping stopped as soon as she approached. She crouched beside the rear benches, listening closely. Nothing. Only the distant songs of waking birds outside. Assuming the cooling iron braces had simply contracted during the cold night, she returned to her blanket, though curiosity lingered quietly in her thoughts. After sunrise, she decided to inspect every corner of her unusual new home before beginning repairs. She tightened loose bolts holding several benches in place. She replaced cracked window latches using small nails salvaged from discarded crates outside. She climbed onto the roof to clear away thick mats of leaves clogging the rain gutters, discovering that only 3 small holes required patching before winter. Every improvement strengthened her conviction that people too often abandon perfectly useful things because restoring them required patience instead of money. Late that afternoon, while removing a warped panel near the rear baggage section, she noticed something unexpected. The wall behind it sounded different when struck lightly with the wooden handle of her hammer. Most of the coach answered with a deep, solid thud. One narrow section responded with a distinctly hollow echo. Evelyn frowned thoughtfully. She tapped again. Hollow. She measured the surrounding boards carefully. One vertical seam appeared almost invisible beneath layers of paint, yet unlike every other panel, tiny iron nails secured it from the inside rather than the outer frame. Someone had intentionally concealed that section. Her pulse quickened. She examined every edge until she found an old brass keyhole almost completely hidden beneath hardened varnish. The lock itself remained intact. Whatever rested beyond that wall had been deliberately sealed rather than forgotten. She searched the entire coach for hours, hoping to discover a key. Inside luggage racks, beneath loose floorboards, around broken storage compartments, nothing. Whoever locked the hidden space had taken the key away. Most people would have forced the door immediately, but Nathaniel Hart had taught his daughter never to damage craftsmanship before understanding why it existed. She decided patience might reveal another answer. During the following days, she continued repairing the coach while earning small coins, sharpening tools, and mending broken furniture for farmers living several miles outside town. Families who cared more about honest work than ugly rumors from Bracken Ridge. Every evening she returned to the abandoned railroad car carrying bits of scrap lumber, spare hinges, or leftover paint kindly offered by grateful customers. Slowly, the forgotten coach transformed. Curtains stitched from old flour sacks softened the windows. A tiny iron stove rescued from a demolished hunting cabin warmed the interior during chilly nights. Flower boxes appeared beneath the surviving windows, planted with wild asters gathered along nearby hillsides. Travelers passing the abandoned siding began slowing their wagons in surprise, unable to understand why the old railroad car looked less like a ruin with every passing week. Even Silas Rowan smiled each time he visited. "Never thought I'd see that coach alive again," the old watchman admitted. "Neither did it," Evelyn replied with quiet laughter. One crisp October evening, Silas carried an old lantern into the coach, while sharing stories about the railroad's earliest years. Before retiring as yard watchman, He had worked maintenance crews across nearly every line threading through the surrounding mountains. As memories returned, his weathered face softened. That coach wasn't always forgotten, he said unexpectedly. Years ago, folks called her the Silver Lark, finest inspection carriage the railway ever built. Evelyn looked around with renewed curiosity. Inspection carriage? Silas nodded. Executives, engineers, surveyors, important people rode inside her before newer coaches replaced her. They said one chief engineer practically lived in this car during the mountain expansion. Do you remember his name? Silas thought quietly before answering. Edmund Ashcombe. Serious fellow. Fair man too. Treated laborers the same way he treated investors. Didn't happen often back then. The name settled gently into Evelyn's thoughts. What became of him? She asked. Silas stared toward the darkening mountains visible through the dusty window. Vanished. Vanished. One autumn morning he never arrived at the next station. Railroad claimed illness forced him east. Others whispered robbery. Some believed he simply retired. Nobody ever knew. Evelyn glanced almost instinctively toward the concealed compartment, hidden behind the rear wall. She chose not to mention it. That night, after Silas departed, she sat beside the little stove, turning the old engineer's name over in her mind. Edmund Ashcombe, a respected railway engineer who disappeared while traveling inside the very coach she now owned. The coincidence felt too deliberate to ignore. The following morning she examined the hidden panel again. This time she noticed faint scratches surrounding the brass lock, not the careless marks of thieves but tiny symbols carved with extraordinary precision. Years of varnish had nearly erased them, yet sunlight entering through the side window revealed 3 tiny railroad lanterns engraved in a row beside a compass, rows no larger than a thumbnail. Beneath them appeared 2 carefully carved words almost invisible beneath the paint. Last promise. Evelyn drew a slow breath. Those words had not been intended as decoration. Someone had wanted them hidden where only careful eyes would eventually discover them. She rested her fingertips gently upon the weathered wood, sensing that the forgotten railroad car had finally begun revealing the secret it had guarded through decades of silence. And although she still possessed no key, she understood with growing certainty that the locked compartment contained far more than forgotten belongings. It contained the final unfinished duty of a man whose disappearance had never truly been explained. And somewhere beyond that thin wooden wall waited the first piece of a promise that history itself had almost allowed to disappear forever. She resisted every temptation to force the hidden compartment open, because patience had carried her farther than haste ever had, and instead she began searching for clues left elsewhere inside the coach by the mysterious Edmund Ashcombe. Every brass fitting, every luggage rack, every bench hinge, and every storage cabinet received the careful attention of her experienced hands. She polished tarnished metal with scraps of cloth, removed years of hardened dust from carved woodwork, and slowly uncovered details no one had noticed since the Silver Lark had last carried passengers across the frontier. On the 3rd afternoon, she found a tiny brass plaque beneath one of the rear benches, nearly hidden beneath layers of old paint. Most people would have overlooked it, but the edge of the plate reflected a faint sliver of sunlight. Kneeling carefully, Evelyn scraped away the paint until elegant engraved letters emerged. Built by Ashcombe Railway Works, 1871. She paused. The engineer's surname appeared again. It could hardly be coincidence. If Edmund Ashcombe had supervised the construction of the coach itself, then the hidden compartment had almost certainly been designed by his own hands. That realization changed everything. Rather than searching randomly, she began thinking like a craftsman. Her father had often said that anyone who built something well always left behind a pattern of thought, and if another craftsman paid close enough attention, that pattern could still be followed years later. Evelyn examined the decorative wood carvings running along the walls of the coach. Most displayed simple vines, leaves, and wildflowers, but near the concealed compartment she noticed 3 carved oak leaves pointing subtly toward a brass lantern bracket. The bracket itself appeared ordinary until she discovered that it could rotate slightly, though only a few degrees. Curious, she turned it gently clockwise. Somewhere inside the wall came a faint metallic click. She hurried to the hidden panel, but it remained locked. The mechanism had awakened, yet something else still held it shut. Encouraged rather than disappointed, she searched for another clue. Hours passed before she noticed that the opposite wall contained another lantern bracket carved with identical oak leaves. This one turned in the opposite direction. Another soft click echoed inside the wall, followed by a sound she had never expected to hear after so many silent years. A heavy bolt slowly slid back inside the hidden compartment. Evelyn held her breath. The brass lock itself remained closed, but now she understood the compartment had been protected by more than a simple key. Whoever designed it had intended only a careful observer to discover its secret. She inserted the narrow blade of one of her father's smallest chisels into the ancient lock, not to force it, but to lift the worn latch that decades of rust had frozen into place. After several patient minutes, the brass mechanism surrendered with a deep metallic snap. Slowly, almost reverently, she pulled the concealed wooden door open. A cool breath of dry air escaped from the darkness within, carrying the unmistakable scent of old cedar and yellowed paper. The hidden compartment was smaller than she expected, barely large enough for a carefully arranged wooden chest, a rolled canvas tube tied with faded blue ribbon, and a leather satchel whose straps had hardened with age. Everything inside remained astonishingly well preserved, protected by cedar lining that had kept moisture away for decades. She lifted the chest first. It was surprisingly light. Inside rested no gold, no jewels, and no stacks of currency. Instead, she found dozens of neatly bundled letters tied together with blue ribbon, each addressed to towns scattered throughout the valley. None had ever been opened. Beneath the letters rested a leather journal, embossed with the initials EA. Evelyn carefully opened the first page. The ink had faded, but remained perfectly legible. "If these pages are ever found," the journal began, "then I have failed to deliver the promise entrusted to me, and whoever reads them now must decide whether that promise deserves another chance." Evelyn felt a chill despite the warmth of the little stove burning nearby. She continued reading. Edmund Ashcombe described traveling through the mountain settlements during the construction of the railway, witnessing isolated farming communities struggle through harsh winters because investors repeatedly abandoned branch lines that promised little immediate profit. Rather than accepting those decisions, he quietly worked with local craftsmen, teachers, physicians, ministers, and landowners to establish a cooperative fund. Each participating town contributed whatever it could spare, not to enrich investors, but to guarantee schools, bridges, grain mills, wells, and emergency supplies whenever disaster struck. The fund belonged equally to every settlement, regardless of wealth. It was, in Edmund's own words, a promise that no forgotten town should ever stand alone. Evelyn turned each page with growing astonishment. Detailed ledgers filled the journal, listing contributions from dozens of frontier families. Every dollar had been accounted for with remarkable precision. Maps showed parcels of land quietly donated for future schools and clinics. Agreements signed by respected citizens pledged mutual assistance whenever hardship struck. Yet the final entries grew increasingly troubled. Powerful railroad financiers had learned of the cooperative. They considered it a threat because it encouraged independent communities rather than dependence upon wealthy investors. Edmund wrote that certain executives demanded he surrender every record. Instead, he hid the documents inside the Silver Lark while searching for trustworthy people willing to protect the promise. His final entry ended abruptly. "If I cannot reach Fair Hollow by sunrise, then someone else must finish what we began. Trust not the loudest voices, but the quiet hands that mend what others abandon." No further pages followed. Evelyn slowly closed the journal. The hidden promise was not treasure in the ordinary sense. It was something far greater. The leather satchel contained the original property deeds for several parcels of land that had never been claimed after their owners disappeared or died without heirs. According to Edmund's notes, those lands legally belonged to the cooperative trust established for the surrounding communities. If the documents remained valid, they represented enough farmland, timber rights, and grazing leases to provide lasting support for struggling settlements across the valley. Yet someone had hidden them before they could ever be used. As dusk settled outside, Evelyn spread the maps across one of the old railway benches. One location immediately caught her attention. A large tract bordering Bracken Ridge Creek had been marked decades earlier for a public grain mill and community storehouse, projects that had never been built. She knew that very property. Horace Bellamy now claimed ownership of those fields, leasing them each harvest for considerable profit. According to Edmund's original deeds, however, Bellamy's ownership should never have existed at all. The land had already been placed into the cooperative trust years before Bellamy ever purchased it. Evelyn read every document twice, then a third time, unwilling to believe what the evidence plainly revealed. Somewhere in the past, the disappearance of Edmund Ashcombe had also erased the legal existence of the cooperative itself, allowing influential businessmen to quietly absorb lands intended for the public good. Suddenly, the accusations against her, the altered freight ledgers, and Horace Bellamy's eagerness to destroy her reputation no longer seemed like isolated misfortunes. They resembled pieces of a much larger pattern, in which powerful men removed honest people whenever honesty threatened their interests. She carefully returned every journal, map, letter, and deed to the cedar-lined compartment before locking it once again. Until she understood whom she could trust, the promise would remain hidden exactly as Edmund Ashcombe had intended. Outside, the evening wind whispered gently through the cottonwood leaves surrounding the old railroad car, almost as though the forgotten engineer himself had waited all those years for someone patient enough to discover not merely what he had hidden, but why he had hidden it at all. If this story has touched your heart so far, subscribe to Berry Tales, leave a like, and share in the comments the place or object you believe still holds an untold story. The following morning dawned beneath a pale silver mist that settled gently over the forgotten rail yard, softening every rusted track and weathered timber, until the abandoned coach seemed less like a relic and more like a quiet guardian, watching over memories no one else remembered. Evelyn rose before sunrise, secured the compartment exactly as she had found it, and slipped Edmund Ashcombe's journal beneath a loose floorboard only she knew about. She trusted the hidden compartment, but she trusted careful preparation even more. If someone unexpectedly searched the coach, they would find nothing beyond old benches, patched curtains, and the simple belongings of a woman everyone believed had already lost everything worth taking. She carried her tool satchel into Bracken Ridge that morning, with a purpose very different from the one she had carried only weeks before. Then she had walked its streets searching for work. Now she walked them searching for truth. She began where every honest investigation should begin, not with accusations, but with records. The county clerk's office occupied a modest brick building beside the courthouse square, its shelves crowded with dusty ledgers recording births, deaths, property transfers, surveys, and tax assessments dating back nearly half a century. The elderly deputy clerk, Amos Whitfield, recognized Evelyn immediately. His expression carried the same uneasy hesitation she had grown accustomed to seeing since the scandal. Yet unlike many others, he did not ask her to leave. Instead, he quietly nodded toward an empty reading table near the window. "Records are open to anyone willing to read them," he said softly before returning to his desk. Evelyn thanked him and requested property maps dating back to the early railroad expansion. Amos disappeared into the archives, returning several minutes later with enormous leather-bound volumes whose cracked bindings testified to decades of faithful use. For hours, Evelyn compared survey maps with the copies hidden inside the railroad coach. At first, everything matched perfectly. Then subtle differences emerged. Entire boundary lines had been redrawn years after Edmund Ashcombe's final journal entry. Parcels marked Community Trust in the original documents now bore the names of private investors. Public access roads had quietly disappeared from official maps. Even the creek running through the valley had been redrawn to alter property boundaries in favor of several large landowners. None of the alterations appeared careless. Each had been executed with remarkable precision, as though someone understood exactly how to change history without attracting attention. One name appeared again and again beside those revised deeds: Theodore Bellamy, father of Horace Bellamy. Evelyn leaned back slowly, allowing the realization to settle. Whatever injustice had begun decades earlier had not ended with Edmund Ashcombe's disappearance. It had simply passed from one generation to the next. She carefully copied every suspicious entry into her notebook before returning the volumes exactly as she had found them. As she prepared to leave, Amos quietly approached. "Miss Hart," he said in a low voice, glancing toward the courthouse entrance to ensure they remained alone. "There are still folks who remember your father. Honest men don't always speak the loudest, but they remember." Before she could answer, he slipped a folded scrap of paper into her hand. Written across it was a single name: Clara Winslow. "She worked the telegraph office before retirement," Amos whispered, "longer than anyone. If there were messages that never reached their destination, she'd know why." Evelyn thanked him sincerely before leaving through the rear entrance. Clara Winslow lived in a small white cottage overlooking the western edge of town, where climbing roses wrapped around a weathered porch despite the approaching winter. She greeted Evelyn warmly, offering tea before asking a single question. "Who finally found Edmund?" Evelyn stared in surprise. "You knew him." Clara smiled sadly. "The finest engineer who ever walked these mountains." Without another word, Evelyn placed the leather journal upon the table. Clara's hands trembled as she recognized the faded initials embossed upon its cover. Tears gathered quietly in her eyes before she even opened the first page. "We waited," she whispered. "For weeks we waited." She explained that Edmund Ashcombe had arranged to meet several trusted citizens in Fair Hollow to establish the cooperative officially. Telegraph messages confirming the meeting had been sent days in advance. Yet on the appointed morning another message arrived instead, claiming Edmund had fallen gravely ill and canceled every appointment indefinitely. Weeks later, the railroad announced his retirement, then his death somewhere back east. Few questioned the story, because official notices confirmed it repeatedly. Clara looked toward the journal with quiet sorrow. "I always believed the telegram wasn't genuine." Evelyn asked why. Clara rose slowly and disappeared into another room before returning with a faded ledger from her years operating the telegraph office. She opened it to a carefully preserved page. Every incoming telegram had been copied by hand before delivery. Beside the message announcing Edmund's illness appeared one tiny notation written in Clara's younger handwriting. "Signature inconsistent. Requested verification denied." Evelyn's heart quickened. "You questioned it?" Clara nodded. "The operator's code was wrong. Whoever sent the telegram knew enough to imitate the office, but not enough to imitate Edmund's personal verification signal." She explained that every senior railroad engineer used a small identifying code attached to important communications to prevent forgery. Edmund's lifelong signal had consisted of 3 dots followed by a dash. The suspicious telegram reversed the order. When Clara requested confirmation, company executives ordered her to file the message without further questions. She obeyed, because refusing might have cost her employment, but she copied her concerns into the ledger before locking it away. "Sometimes," Clara whispered, "all ordinary people can do is preserve the truth until someone brave enough arrives to use it." Evelyn realized she now possessed 3 pieces of evidence pointing toward the same hidden history: Edmund's journal, the original property deeds, and the telegraph record proving official deception. Yet evidence alone would never overcome Horace Bellamy's influence, unless others also chose courage over comfort. As she left Clara's cottage, she noticed 2 unfamiliar men standing across the street, pretending to repair a wagon wheel while watching the house far too carefully. The moment Evelyn looked toward them, they climbed into their wagon and rolled slowly away. She did not recognize either face, but instinct warned her they had not been sent there by coincidence. She chose a different route, back toward the abandoned railroad car, weaving through narrow streets and wooded paths, before reaching the forgotten siding after sunset. Everything appeared undisturbed until she climbed the iron steps into the coach. One of the patched windows stood slightly open. She was certain she had latched it before leaving. Her belongings remained where she had left them, yet someone had searched carefully enough to avoid obvious disorder. The loose floorboard concealing Edmund's journal had been shifted only the slightest fraction of an inch. Barely noticeable. Barely, but noticeable to the woman who had placed it there. Someone knew, or at least suspected, that the abandoned railroad car contained something valuable. Evelyn quietly removed the journal, the deeds, and Clara's copied ledger, wrapping them inside oilcloth before carrying them into the woods under cover of darkness. There, beneath the roots of an ancient white oak overlooking the valley, she prepared a second hiding place, known only to herself. Returning to the coach long after midnight, she restored every floorboard exactly as before. Whoever searched again would find nothing except the patient silence of an old railroad car that had already kept one promise hidden for more than 20 years. For the next several days, Evelyn deliberately behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. She repaired chairs for farmers, sharpened axes for woodcutters, and quietly continued restoring the old railroad coach, one careful board at a time. If anyone happened to watch her from a distance, they would see only a hard-working woman refusing to surrender to misfortune. That was precisely what she wanted them to believe. Inside, however, every moment had become part of a careful plan. She knew someone had searched the coach once, and experience told her they would eventually return. Honest people often assumed patience belonged only to the innocent, but the dishonest could wait just as long whenever something valuable remained hidden. Evelyn intended to discover who came next. 2 evenings later, she spread a thin layer of fresh ash from her stove across the floor near the rear compartment before retiring to her blanket. The ash appeared almost invisible against the weathered oak planks, yet even the lightest footprint would leave a clear impression. Before extinguishing her lantern, she looped a length of fine sewing thread across the inside of the rear door, fastening it loosely enough that anyone entering without careful inspection would break it immediately. Then she carried her blanket outside after midnight and climbed quietly into the thick branches of a sprawling cottonwood overlooking the abandoned siding. Wrapped against the cold beneath a dark wool shawl, she watched her lonely railroad car beneath a sky crowded with brilliant autumn stars. Hours passed. Owls called from distant pines. Freight trains rumbled across the active tracks beyond the valley. Frost slowly gathered upon the rails. Just before dawn, movement finally appeared. A lantern glowed faintly between the trees. 2 men approached without speaking, leading their horses carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. One remained outside while the other climbed the iron steps into the coach with surprising confidence, as though he already knew exactly where he wished to search. Evelyn remained perfectly still among the branches above. A moment later, the faint thread snapped. She heard the slow scrape of boots moving across the wooden floor. Drawers opened, bench lids lifted, tools shifted. The search lasted less than 10 minutes before the man stepped outside, shaking his head. "Nothing," he muttered. "Either she moved it or someone else already found it." The second man lowered his lantern enough for moonlight to illuminate his face. Evelyn recognized him instantly. Samuel Griggs, Horace Bellamy's warehouse foreman. She had worked beside him for nearly 3 years. He had always spoken politely, always tipped his hat respectfully, and always seemed willing to help anyone lifting heavy freight. Yet now he quietly answered, "Mr. Bellamy won't be pleased." Her suspicions hardened into certainty. They mounted their horses and disappeared toward town before sunrise painted the eastern sky. Only after they had vanished completely did Evelyn climb down from the tree. Inside the coach, she found broken thread, fresh boot prints across the ash, and several cupboards carelessly disturbed. The hidden compartment remained untouched because she had removed everything of importance days earlier. She knelt beside the footprints, studying them carefully. One pair belonged to heavy work boots. The other surprised her. Fine leather shoes with narrow heels. Not practical footwear for a warehouse foreman. Someone else had entered before Samuel Griggs arrived. Someone with enough confidence to search alone. She carefully traced the unusual sole pattern into her notebook before sweeping the ash away. Later that morning, she carried one of her repaired chairs into town for delivery. Passing Bellamy's office, she happened to notice a pair of polished leather boots resting beneath the open doorway while Horace conducted business with visiting investors. The sole pattern matched her sketch exactly. Horace Bellamy himself had searched the abandoned railroad car. He had not trusted anyone else to find whatever he believed remained hidden there. Evelyn continued walking without slowing her pace, though her heartbeat quickened. The evidence no longer pointed merely toward old corruption buried beneath forgotten deeds. It reached directly into the present. Horace Bellamy already feared whatever Edmund Ashcombe had concealed. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived at the coach. A young railroad conductor named Isaac Mercer removed his cap respectfully before approaching the steps. "Miss Hart?" he asked cautiously. Evelyn nodded. He looked over his shoulder to ensure nobody had followed him. "Silas Rowan sent me." At once, Evelyn invited him inside. Isaac explained that while preparing an old freight engine for service, he had discovered several maintenance crates scheduled for disposal, because they contained outdated equipment. Hidden beneath the crates rested a locked steel dispatch box no one had opened in years. The faded shipping tag bore a familiar name, Edmund Ashcombe. "Silas thought you ought to see it before the company melts it down for scrap," Isaac whispered. Together they carried the surprisingly heavy box into the coach. Its steel surface had rusted badly, yet the lock had already broken away. Inside rested rolled engineering blueprints, surveying instruments wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and several wax-sealed envelopes bearing the insignia of the original railway board. One envelope had never been opened. Evelyn carefully unfolded the accompanying letter. It described the official approval of Edmund Ashcombe's cooperative transportation plan, signed by 3 directors years before Theodore Bellamy quietly assumed control of the regional railway division. Attached to the approval rested something even more astonishing: a certified register listing every trustee appointed to oversee the cooperative. The final surviving signature belonged not to a wealthy investor or influential politician, but to Nathaniel Hart, Evelyn's father. She stared silently at the faded ink. Her father had never spoken about serving as trustee. Perhaps he had considered the duty too dangerous once Edmund disappeared. Perhaps he intended to explain everything when Evelyn grew older. Instead, he had died believing the promise had vanished forever. Tears gathered quietly in her eyes, not from grief alone but from the realization that her arrival at the abandoned railroad car had not been mere chance. Without ever knowing it, she had followed the path her father once helped build. Isaac looked toward her uncertainly. "Does it mean something?" Evelyn smiled through moist eyes. "More than I can explain." They spent hours studying the blueprints. One map revealed proposed branch lines connecting isolated farming communities without charging excessive freight fees. Another showed locations for public wells, grain depots, and emergency shelters funded through the cooperative trust. Edmund's vision had never been about wealth. It had been about ensuring that no frontier settlement could be abandoned simply because profit favored another route. As evening approached, Isaac carefully repacked the dispatch box. "Others should know," he said quietly. Evelyn agreed, but she also understood that exposing the truth too soon might allow Horace Bellamy to destroy what evidence remained. She needed more than documents. She needed witnesses whose honesty the entire valley respected. She thought of Amos Whitfield, Clara Winslow, Silas Rowan, and now Isaac Mercer. Ordinary people, quiet people, the very kind Edmund Ashcombe had trusted from the beginning. Beyond the coach windows, the setting sun bathed the forgotten siding in warm amber light, and for the first time since Bracken Ridge had rejected her, Evelyn no longer felt alone. The promise hidden inside the abandoned railroad car had begun gathering people together again, just as it had been intended to do more than 20 years before, and although powerful men still held influence over the town, they could no longer erase a truth that patient hands had carefully preserved across an entire generation. At sunrise, the courthouse bell rang with a steadier sound than anyone in Bracken Ridge could remember. Not because the bell itself had changed, but because the people listening to it had. One by one, they gathered beneath the broad wooden porch where Amos Whitfield laid the original property records beside Clara Winslow's telegraph ledger, where Isaac Mercer unlocked Edmund Ashcombe's steel dispatch box, and where Silas Rowan quietly testified that the abandoned railroad car had never been merely another forgotten coach left to rot beside unused tracks. Evelyn spoke last. She did not raise her voice, accuse her enemies with bitterness, or seek revenge for the weeks she had spent hungry and alone. Instead, she simply placed Edmund's weathered journal upon the table and invited everyone to read the final promise written in his own hand. The silence that followed was deeper than any speech. Farmers recognized the signatures of their grandparents. Elderly widows saw family names they had believed history had erased. Craftsmen remembered stories passed down by fathers who had once spoken of a cooperative dream that mysteriously vanished before it could ever take root. Truth, patiently preserved, began restoring what fear had broken. Faced with original deeds, authenticated railway records, the telegraph ledger, and living witnesses whose integrity could not honestly be questioned, Horace Bellamy found that influence alone could no longer protect deception. The altered freight ledgers that had destroyed Evelyn's reputation were examined by independent officials, and the differences in ink, handwriting, and paper became impossible to deny. The false accusations against her collapsed under the weight of the evidence, while the quiet web of land transfers stretching back to Theodore Bellamy slowly unraveled before the law. No angry celebration followed. No crowd demanded humiliation. Justice arrived the way true justice often does, not with shouting, but with the steady correction of what should never have been changed. The cooperative trust established by Edmund Ashcombe was legally restored, and the lands intended for the people returned to their rightful purpose. A grain mill rose beside Bracken Ridge Creek, exactly where the original plans had marked it, decades earlier. A public workshop welcomed carpenters, blacksmiths, and wheelwrights who taught young apprentices without charging families who could scarcely afford bread. A small library opened inside the renovated depot, its shelves filled with donated books from every settlement across the valley. Travelers passing through no longer found forgotten communities struggling alone through harsh winters, because the promise hidden inside the abandoned railroad car had finally become the living reality Edmund had imagined. When the townspeople offered Evelyn a large share of the recovered property in gratitude, she quietly declined everything except the old railroad coach itself. "It already gave me more than I could ever repay," she said with a gentle smile. The Silver Lark remained on its quiet siding, but it no longer stood abandoned. Children visited after school to hear stories of the frontier. Elderly neighbors gathered there during cool evenings to share memories before they disappeared with time. Travelers rested beneath its restored roof, and every spring wildflowers bloomed beside its iron wheels, as though the land itself wished to honor the promise that had slept within its walls for so many years. Sometimes visitors asked Evelyn why she had never sold the coach once its history became famous. She would simply rest her hand upon the weathered oak beside the once hidden compartment and answer, "Some things are worth more because they remind us who we become when we choose to keep our promises." We began by telling you about a 32-year-old woman who had been cast out with only a few coins to her name, foolish enough in everyone else's eyes to spend almost all of them on an abandoned railroad car. We end by remembering that the world often mistakes forgotten things for worthless things, and forgotten people for defeated people. Yet Evelyn Hart proved that quiet hands can restore what loud voices overlook, that patience can outlast deception, and that the greatest treasures are not always measured in gold, but in promises faithfully kept, until the right person is ready to carry them forward. Long after those who wronged her faded into history, the story of the woman who rescued an abandoned railroad car continued traveling farther than any locomotive that had ever passed through Bracken Ridge, reminding each generation that hope sometimes waits behind the very door everyone else chooses not to open. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If this story stayed with you, we'd be honored if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked people and forgotten places can still change the world. Tell us in the comments, what is one time you discovered unexpected value in something everyone else had written off? And if you love heartfelt frontier stories filled with hope, resilience, and unforgettable mysteries, be sure to subscribe to Berry Tales so you never miss our next journey. Until next time, stay close, take care of one another, and never underestimate the quiet power of a promise kept.